We shall begin. So as I said, that we're going to take a little break from the Maimon for a few days. And we're going to go over the story of Yitas Kislev with all its details. Because this Yont of Yitas Kislev is actually the most, I would say, central Yont in all of the special days in the Hasidic calendar, as we'll try to explain as we go along. So I think it's very important to know the history and everything that happened and whatever's connected to it. Usually we have a whole week to do this. This week we'll have less, so we'll try to condense it as much as possible. So let's start. No, this is going to be the oral Torah.
All right.
I'm just reading from a Hebrew edition of this and my own notes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right here. This is the Dalit
Yutes,
Kislev.
the 19th of Kislev. So the 19th of Kislev, which is the holiday we celebrate, the Alter Rebbe was released from jail. What was the Alter Rebbe doing in jail in the first place? So let me give the background. Background is as follows. When the Baal Shem Tov came out with the teachings of Chassidus, he was met with tremendous opposition. And the opposition was not from people that didn't appreciate Torah, didn't appreciate mitzvahs. On the contrary, it came from some of the greatest rabbis and greatest leaders in the Torah community. And what was the reason for this really tremendous opposition, very, very almost vicious opposition? So the reason for this is that a little bit before, let me say that this person I'm going to talk about, his name was Shabtai Tzvi, he died in 1676. And about 20 years later, 1698, that's when Baal Shem Tov was born. And 36 years later, in 1734, the Baal Shem Tov was revealed. That means when the Baal Shem Tov came out with his teachings, it was about 50 years after the death of this person, Shabtai Tzvi. Who and what was Shabtai Tzvi? Shabtai Tzvi was a Jew who lived in Turkey. And this was a time when the teachings of Kabbalah were totally not accessible as it is today. And even though it was studied already more than before, but still not as common, he studied Kabbalah. He gathered a few students that were his sort of inner circle. And after a while, he began to declare himself as Mashiach. And he was apparently a great Torah scholar. And apparently he was very charismatic. And people were being attracted to him, and people accepted what he said. And first they were hushing it, and then they started to publicize it. However, one of the most important things about Mashiach is that he's going to be the person who's going to strengthen Torah and to spread Torah and even bring those who are away from Torah, bring them closer to Torah. And as soon as you see someone violating Torah, you know that this is the wrong person. And that's what happened with him. But in those days, communication was not like today. Nobody knew what's true, what's hearsay, what's being exaggerated, what's a rumor. But eventually, this is what happened. He began to violate certain aspects of Torah. I think one of the first things he did, he ate certain food, when you take the meat of an animal, there's fats in the animal that you have to be knowledgeable which of the fats is kosher, which is not kosher. The one that's not kosher is not just not kosher, but it's punishable by death. It's very serious. And anyone who is a butcher for kosher food has to be taught what to take out. Anyway, he ate this food and he did something really crazy. He made a bracha before. And the bracha he made was he took the words from davening, distorted the meaning, and that was his bracha. In the morning davening, we make a bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, matir asurim, which means thank God for untying those that are bounded. which generally means when you wake up in the morning, you're just not as flexible because you were sleeping all night in one position. So you thank Hashem that you can flex your hands, your feet, your body, and sit up and so on. But asurim, which means bounded, can also mean osur, something which is prohibited. And matir means untie. So we make a bracha, thank you Hashem for untying, which means permitting that which is prohibited. Then we ate this food. And when he was questioned, well, how could you do this? His answer was that Mashiach has tremendous knowledge of Kabbalah, and he knows the deep secrets of Torah. And based on what he knows, this is okay. And he can't explain it to ordinary people. There's no such thing in Judaism. Everything has to have a source, especially when it goes against halacha. And it went from one thing to the next. Then he violated Shabbos, and then he got involved with relationships with women that were not inappropriate, and went down the line. The final thing which broke the spell, because he had hundreds, maybe thousands of people that were following him, what did break the spell was that eventually word got to the Sultan that this man claims that soon he's going to become the king, and he will take the crown of the Sultan's head and put it on his head. Well, that's outright rebellion, so they arrested him. Not only arrested him, but he was on trial, and he was going to be executed. Before they executed him, they said there's only one way that his life can be saved, if he agrees to convert to Islam. And we know that Jews give up their lives not to convert to another religion. But he converted to Islam, changed his name, and when they asked him, how could you do such a thing? His answer was the same thing. This is an extremely deep secret in Kabbalah, and he has to elevate the sparks in the other religions and all sorts of explanations. But at that point, 99% of the Jewish community knew that he was a fake, and they abandoned him. But they say that he still had about 200 people that followed him. They all converted to Islam, and unfortunately, that was a very big tragedy. Then he died, and the movement quieted down. And being that it was based on Kabbalah, so he would do things like going to the mikveh and dancing and davening and a lot of things which are based on teachings of Kabbalah. Comes along the Baal Shem Tov, tell people to go to the mikveh and learn Kabbalah, Chassidus, and dancing and singing and davening. There was no doubt in anyone's mind at that time that this is a revival of the Shabtai Tzvi movement. In other words, there were 200 people that followed him. Apparently, they were quiet about it because now they were outnumbered. But it looks like this is coming back again. So what do you do when something like that happens? You try to nip it in the bud. And immediately all the rabbis came out against it, and this person should be excommunicated, this person should be this and that. And it was very difficult for the Hasidim to function. A lot of places they were hidden, they hid their identity. And this went on in the times of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, the Mezrich, and the same with the Alter Rebbe.
So Alter Rebbe came right after Shabtai Tzvi, so everyone was like...
No, the Baal Shem Tov came 50 years after Shabtai Tzvi. And Maggid was the next generation. The Alter Rebbe was the third generation, but it was still going on. There was still a strong opposition. And like I said, it wasn't so simple. It was coming from great rabbis. And as we'll soon see, the greatest Torah authority in the world at the time lived in a city in Lithuania called Vilna. His name was the Vilna Gaon. He was brilliant, genius. Probably nobody in the generation could match him in terms of his knowledge of Torah. And he came out very strongly against the Hasidim. Now, the reason, how could they do that if the Hasidim are really who they are? And the answer was because it's a little bit like a trauma. You know, when you have a trauma, in Yiddish they say, when you get burned by touching hot water, you start blowing when you touch cold water. When you go through a trauma, anything that even resembles that trauma, you fly off the handle. So basically, after the Jewish community was so traumatized by Shabtai Tzvi, as soon as they saw some resemblance, they came out against it. And it's almost like they didn't even want to hear people speaking in their defense because they figured that it's all, covered up and camouflaged and they're not saying the truth. And they came out very strong. And there's a lot of stories about the opposition and how the Hasidim suffered. But this is where this is the background where this is all about. What did happen was that because the Vilna Gaon was at the head, it was clear that if he would change his mind, everybody would change their mind. So the Alter Rebbe, who was also a brilliant genius in Gemara and Halacha and not just Hasidus and Kabbalah, took another of his colleagues, his name was Mendel Hardaker, who was also a brilliant Torah genius from Lithuania. Both the Alter Rebbe and him were both from Lithuania. And they decided we're going to go speak to him face to face, answer all his questions, explain everything we're doing, and that'll calm down the whole machlekes, the whole fight. Unfortunately, when they got there, he refused to see them. People begged, people pleaded, and they said that this will calm down. The whole Jewish community is on fire, and it's no good for anybody. But he refused. And what was the reason why he refused? This is also the influence of people around him that said that, we know that this is treif. And if you're going to meet with them, even if you come out and say that you met with them and it's really not acceptable, but people are still going to say, oh, he met with them. So that's sort of validating them. And then it's going to be worse. So he never met with them. And as a result of that, this big conflict continued to rage. And was to a point where, being that they felt that these people were a danger to Yiddishkeit, so they did things like find ways of getting Hasidim arrested, filing false accusations. They did things like boycotting their businesses. If a Chassid had a store, a grocery, they boycotted his store. Nobody should come to. If he went to shul, he'd never be called up to the shul. They wouldn't use him for the minyan. Do all sorts of things to make their life miserable. At a certain point, 3 Hasidic leaders, one was the one I just mentioned, Rabbi Mendel of Hardok, Rabbi Yisrael of Polotsk, and another Rebbe called Rabbi Roma Kalisk, they, together with a few hundred families, decided to leave Europe and they're going to Israel. And over there was no opposition. All the opposition was coming from Lithuania, and they'd be able to live peacefully. And that's what they did. The Alter Rebbe was part of the group. He also went. But what happened was that in the middle of this journey, he thought about it again. And even though at that time the Maggid HaMezritch was no longer here physically, so he looked up to the Ramen Hardaker as his sort of temporary Rebbe. And he consulted with him, and eventually they came to the decision. The Alter Rebbe said, I'm going back, and I'm going to spread Chassidus, and I'm going to stand up to all the challenges and do whatever I can to make it happen. So Alter Rebbe came back. The Alter Rebbe, besides being just a great tzaddik and a great Torah scholar, was also very charismatic and had tremendous leadership qualities, very organized, and he organized activities and shiurim and underground ways of reaching Jews all over. And really, for a period of about 20 years, thousands of people became Hasidim. And to a certain extent, the real heat of the conflict calmed down a little bit because so many more people became Hasidim. What caused it to erupt again was the Vilna Gaon, this great leader of the Lithuanian community, passed away. And when he passed away, people used that opportunity to say, oh, the Hasidim were rejoicing, they were dancing, or they did this, or did that. All this was not true. In fact, everything they said about Hasidim was really not true. Because I just want to say that whenever there's a conflict, whether it's in a shul, whether it's any place else, and there are 2 groups fighting, there's always 2 categories of people that get involved in a conflict. One category is people that are just sincere, and each party has their way of looking at things. So I'm very, very strong about that things have to be one way. The other guy says, and he feels strong they have to be another way, and therefore they're arguing. But then there's always going to be those people who love a good fight. And they're going to pour as much oil on the flames as they can to make the fight bigger, find excuses, even say things which are not true and exaggerate just to sort of fan the flames of this fire. And that's what happened with the Chassidim as well. There were definitely so many people who were sincere, but they were afraid that the Hasidic movement is something which goes against Yiddishkeit. At the same time, there were people who were not sincere, and they just were in it for the good fight. And they went ahead and they actually exaggerated, they fabricated, and said things which were not true in order to make the fight stronger. And some of them even went to the rabbinical court and testified they saw this or they saw that. And as a result of that, the rabbinical court in the Lithuanian circles came out even stronger against the Hasidim. To give one example, one of the things Shabtai Tzvi did, they said Mashiach is here and he's Mashiach, and therefore you no longer have to fast on Tisha B'Av. So they came to the rabbinical court and they testified that they themselves saw with their own eyes that Hasidim were eating and drinking on Tisha B'Av. And that's a clear sign that they must be followers of this Shabtai Tzvi movement. And when you come to a court of rabbis and two people testify, that's considered 100% valid. In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, a person would be put to death based on the testimony of two witnesses. Later it was discovered that the story was true. They just left out one detail. The detail was that year it was Shabbos. So it was the 9th of Av. They were eating and drinking. Oh, we left out a technical detail that it was Shabbos. But whoever came to do this, and this is not one of the sort of stories which are hearsay, this is a story which is documented. And on this basis, the Bezdin came out with a very sharp to condemning the Hasidic movement. And it was all based on a lie. And we'll see later what they did the same with the Tanya. The Tanya in those days was not printed.
But did the Beit Din find out the truth later?
What?
Did the Beit Din find out the truth later? Or?
Much later. It took a long time till it came out, In other words, had they done real thorough investigation, they could have figured all this out. But I guess because it was naturally accepted that this is a bad movement, and now someone comes along and adds another piece of information, it just fits into the puzzle. So they didn't make that effort to do the real investigation that you're supposed to do, which we'll talk about later. So therefore, in this case too, people fabricated a story that when the Vilna Gaon passed away, the Hasidim were rejoicing and they made a joke out of the whole thing, and that infuriated so many people. And that's when this machlekes, this conflict became even stronger. At this point, there were so many people that became Hasidim, and so many people met Hasidim and saw that they're religious Jews. They keep Shabbat, they keep kosher, they keep mitzvahs. In fact, they're very God-fearing. In many ways, they're even more than the ordinary person. And it's absurd to say that they're following some sort of movement which goes against Torah. It was clear that these are Torah-observant Jews. So they could no longer push that story that these are not from and so on. And that's when they decided we need a new method. They actually organized this. I said it just yesterday. It wasn't just people were against Hasidim. It was organized. There was a committee. They were in charge of fighting the Hasidim, and they had people in different cities that were under their charge. And they decided that what they're going to do is eliminate, God forbid, the Alter Rebbe. How to do that? By filing false accusations in the government and accusing him of some very serious crimes. And then the government will, God forbid, eliminate Alter Rebbe. And once the head is eliminated, the whole body will just fall apart. That was their approach. What was the accusation that they thought of? So we mentioned before that the 3 Rebbes and a few hundred families moved to Eretz Yisrael. Initially, they moved to the city of Hebron. The Alter Rebbe went back home. Even though he returned back home, Alter Rebbe made a commitment. In those days, Israel was not what it is today, of course, and actually it was a land of poverty. So the Alter Rebbe made a commitment that he will collect money from his Hasidim to support the family. In other words, even though physically I'm not going to be there, but I will be there by supporting financially the families that live there. And that tzedakah fund was called Meir Balanes, so we call it today Kol Chabad. And a lot of the letters in Tanya, the 4th volume of Tanya, there are letters. Most of those letters are about giving tzedakah in general, and specifically tzedakah to strengthen Eretz Yisrael. But that was a time that a few hundred families settled in Israel, and the Alter Rebbe collected money. Israel in those days was under the Turkish rule. Turkey and Russia didn't really like each other too much. So the accusation was that here the Alter Rebbe is sending thousands of ruble to Turkey. And the reason is because they're planning to build a big army to eventually overthrow Russia, and Turkey will take over. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is involved in a real serious crime of trying to create a revolution and overthrow the Tsar. So they came to arrest the Alter Rebbe after this. It was actually Yontif. It was the middle of Sukkot. And a general, other officers, they came to look for the Alter Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe heard that they're coming, he slipped out to the back door and he hid somewhere. What was his reason? There's a pasuk that says, Chabi ma'at rega ad yaver zam, which means, wait a moment, maybe the wrath will pass. Which means that just like with a human being, there are times where you're in a good mood, and there are times you're in a bad mood. Lahavdil, not to compare, it's just a mushal. But in the spiritual realm, there's also times where for Hashem, it's a time of wrath, time of gevura. And there's a time where it's a time of chesed. So there's a pasuk that says, if God forbid you see negative things happening, which means it's time of wrath, wait a moment and sort of weather the storm. It'll be over, and then you'll be able to go on and do what you need to do. So Alter Rebbe thought, maybe I'll just wait a little bit until this time is over, and I wouldn't have to end up getting arrested. That was number one. Number two, he wanted to decide himself, should he allow himself to get arrested and go through this or not? And at the end, the Alter Rebbe made a decision that he's going to go through with the process. He's going to let himself get arrested and prove his innocence, which is very risky. This was not America, this was Russia. And this was an accusation that was a very serious accusation, but nevertheless, Alter Rebbe decided to do that. And sure enough, right after Yontif, they came back again. And this time they arrested the Alter Rebbe. It was the second day, it was the day after Yontif, Isru Chag. When they arrested the Alter Rebbe, he was arrested in a vehicle. In those days, the vehicle was a horse and wagon, but it was known as the Black Wagon, which meant whoever was arrested and put into this wagon is being arrested because of serious crimes, very sensitive issues with the government, issues of treason, issues of revolution or anything related to that. And usually people knew that if someone was arrested in such a way, the Tsar didn't tolerate, they didn't think about, all the thoughts people should be given a chance to defend themselves. If they had any doubt or any question about somebody, it was 1, 2, 3, they would just put away with him. So it was really very frightening for the Chassidim to see the Alter Rebbe was arrested in that black wagon. They had no idea what the accusation was, but just seeing this wagon meant that it's a very serious accusation. The Alter Rebbe immediately organized things before he even left. He told the Chassidim that they should have bitachon. Like in every situation, you have to have trust in Hashem. That in the schus of all the great tzaddikim, the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, he'll come out of this. And the Alter Rebbe also told the Chassidim, the older Chassidim, that they must supervise the younger Chassidim during this time. People shouldn't do things that are wild. And he also cautioned the younger Chassidim that they must listen to the older Chassidim and follow everything that they say. And immediately the Chassidim organized themselves and they got together. They made different meetings of what to do. First of all, they all decided that this time should be dedicated to prayer and to fasting. In those days, fasting was still acceptable. And that, first of all, they would fast X times a week. And even when they do eat, they're not going to eat meat. They won't make any weddings, a lot of restrictions. This is a time to be totally focused on davening for the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was arrested on a Thursday night. So the next day is Friday. And the Alter Rebbe's custom was that Friday afternoon, in Shulchan Aruch it says that you shouldn't travel Friday after midday because you might get stuck on the road. And therefore, people don't apply it today as much because we have cars. We have different methods of communication, of transportation. Years ago, it was a horse and wagon. Today, you can be closer to the place 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon than years ago, 10 o'clock in the morning. So the halacha still applies, but it's according to our standards. But the Alter Rebbe's custom was that whether it's far or close, after 6 hours before Shabbos, even if it's earlier in the day, he wouldn't travel. Now this was this time of the year, so it was 6 hours before Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe turned to the officer that was in charge and said, "I'd like you to stop the horse and wagon and not travel on Shabbos." Could you imagine? You're being arrested for serious crimes, and you tell the person who's arresting you, "Now I want to don't do what you want to do. I want to take a break for 24 hours." Of course, they didn't listen to him. Shortly after that, the axle of the wagon broke. They stopped. So they sent someone to the nearest town. They brought a repair person, and he fixed it. They started moving. One of the horses died. So they sent someone to the nearest town to get a new horse, and they got a new horse. And then the strangest things happened. The horses wouldn't move. They whipped them. They did all the tricks in the book to get a horse to move. The horses wouldn't move. And only then did it dawn on him that, I don't know what they understood, he's a tzaddik or it's black magic, but they realized that he's doing it. So they said to him, "Okay, we won't travel. So at least allow us to go to the nearest town." The Alter Rebbe said, "No, I don't travel 6 hours before Shabbos. At least allow us to go to the side of the road. Do we have to be here right in the middle of the road?" So no, that's okay. And the horses started to move. They moved to the side of the road. And the Alter Rebbe spent that Shabbos under a tree near a city called Nevel. The Hasidim of that city knew where that tree was. And that's where this sort of miracle took place. So this was the Thursday and the Friday after the Alter Rebbe was arrested. When the Alter Rebbe was arrested, before he actually went into this wagon, his brother-in-law, his name is Rabbi Majeski, said to Alter Rebbe, "Tell me, what can we do?" The Alter Rebbe said to him the follows: "You go immediately to Petersburg, but immediately, and send someone to Rabbi Yitzchak or Barditchev to ask for a bracha." In other words, we know that when God forbid there's any kind of crisis, we always write to the Rebbe for a bracha. What does the Rebbe do when he's in a crisis? So there's a rule: you can't unlock yourself. Then you need to turn to someone else to pray for you. I mean, chas v'shalom, every person has to pray for themselves. But in order for someone to do something to unlock you from your situation, you have to turn to someone outside of that. So he chose one of the tzaddikim of that time. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Barditchev, that a chassid should travel to him and ask him for a bracha for the Alter Rebbe. So this person, whose name Rabbi Yisrael Kozik, the brother-in-law, immediately went to Petersburg. And in those days, when you travel from one city to another city in Russia, you needed a passport. But being the Alter Rebbe repeated twice, "But you should go immediately." So he didn't go home to get his passport. What he did was he borrowed a passport from a friend that resembled him a little bit, and that was his, or maybe, I don't know, they had pictures in passports those days, I don't know, but he took the name, someone else's passport, and he went. The other chassid went to Rabbi Yitzchak Barditchev, and when he heard, of course, he was very emotional, he broke down, and then, and he had to ask him, they asked him for I should pray for him, what is his mother's name? When you pray for someone, you have to know their name and their mother's name. So the chassid said they were so confused, he forgot to ask, what's the Alter Rebbe's mother's name? So Rabbi Yitzchak opened the Chumash, and he opened to a pasuk in next week's parsha, and it says, and Yaakov saw that there's shever in Mitzrayim. Shever means there's food. This was where there was a hunger. And in Egypt, you can go get food. The word shever is spelled 3 letters, Shin, Beis, Reish. So he said, oh, his name is Shneir ben Rivka. Rachel could be anything. But he saw Rivka, which is of course the Alter Rebbe's mother's name. And the Alter Rebbe very often, even though he had two names, Shneir Zalman, there were times he would only sign one name, Shneir ben Rivka. When they brought the Alter Rebbe to the jail, they brought him to a separate department, which was specifically reserved for people who are being accused of treason and of revolutionary activities. And the Alter Rebbe wanted to know whether, at least in the natural order, does this mean once you go to this place, that's it, and this person is surely executed? But of course, the guards wouldn't tell him anything. So Alter Rebbe said to the guard, tell me, when people come out of here, do they ever give you a tip? So he said, some people do, some people don't. So Alter Rebbe had his answer, that in Derech HaTeva, even in the natural order, there's hope that you can come out of this place alive. Well, as soon as Alter Rebbe got there, one of the officers came to question him, interrogate him, speak to him. This person had to be very knowledgeable in Torah. I guess he wasn't Jewish, but knowledgeable in Torah. And said to the Alter Rebbe, how do you explain when it says in the Chumash that God said to Adam, where are you? After he ate from the tree, he was hiding. Hashem said, where are you? Hashem knows everything. The Alter Rebbe told him what Rashi says, that Hashem said it just to sort of open the conversation. So he said, I know what Rashi says. I want to hear what you say. What's your insight into this? The Alter Rebbe said to him, do you believe that everything that's written in Torah is eternal? Because it comes from God who is eternal. And therefore, the message in these words and the meaning of these words are also eternal. He says, yes, I believe that. And the Alter Rebbe said that itself made him happy because, number one, he saw the person believes in God. And he believes in Torah being something eternal, which is also connected to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, that everything in Torah, the lessons are all eternal. And then he said to him, I'll tell you what it means. It means that Hashem calls every person at all times and says to him, Ayeka, where are you in this world? Every person was given a certain amount of years to live. And the question is, what have you done? How many people have you helped? Have you done favors to people? And says, for example, you are X amount of years old. They told him exactly how old he was. And are you answering this call of Hashem? Ayeka, where are you? He got all excited. He slapped the Alter Rebbe on the back and he said, bravo, or hurrah, whatever they say in Russia. Like, wow, how did you figure that out? Exactly how old I am. And then he continued to talk with the Alter Rebbe and his mind was just blown away. And he said, this is a godly person without a question. He was convinced at the first meeting, the Alter Rebbe is innocent and so on. And in fact, he told other people that he believes that this is just jealousy. He had so many discussions with him. He's brilliant, he's intelligent, and he's a good person, an honest person, and so on. Nope. What happened was that after this incident, a few other things happened, and the people in the jail sort of were having a good time. They were testing out the Alter Rebbe's wisdom. As an example, one of the things that happened, he was in a place which was a dark cell, no light, no windows, no doors, nothing. And one time they said to him, why don't you go to sleep already? It's after midnight. So Alter Rebbe said, not exactly, it's 5 after 2 right now. Why should I go to sleep? In the afternoon. So they said to the Alter Rebbe, how did you figure that out? It was 5 after 2. And his answer was, I think I mentioned this in the previous class, that there are 4 letters in Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, but there are 12 different ways of combining the letters, the order, and every hour of the day, the letters are arranged in a different arrangement. So based on what light of Hashem is shining, you can tell what time it is. Very simple. Word of this Alter Rebbe reached the Tsar himself about his greatness, and the Tsar decided that he wants to check it out himself. So he got dressed up a little bit different. The Alter Rebbe naturally never saw him. In those days, there weren't pictures of people like there are today. And he got dressed up like a Rebbe officer, and he walked in. The Alter Rebbe stood up and gave him the honor that a king deserves. And he says, Alter Rebbe, what are you doing? Why are you giving me so much honor? As if I was a king or something. The Alter Rebbe said, you're definitely the king. Because the Gemara says that kingdom in this world is a reflection of kingdom in that world. When you walked in, I was overcome with such a sense of awe that I did not feel by any of the officers that came in. So I understand that you must be the king himself. So then the king himself saw how the Alter Rebbe is not an ordinary person, is really a godly person. And all this helped eventually to make his case, easier. Remember we said before that Alter Rebbe's brother-in-law was told, go straight to Petersburg. So this officer, who was so impressed with the Alter Rebbe, said to him one of the first days, he says, what can I do to do you a favor? Is there anything I can do for you? So Alter Rebbe says, yes. Remember, in those days, it wasn't that you can call up the facility and say, so how is this and this person doing? There was no word. Nobody knew where he is. Nobody knew if he's alive or not. Nobody knew what happened. Alter Rebbe says, the biggest favor you can do to me is if you would let my family know, and the Chassidim should know that I'm alive and I'm okay, and where I am. And that I hope that eventually it will be proven that I'm innocent. So he said, but the Chassidim and those who oppose Chassidim all look alike to me. They're all Jews. They're all religious Jews. How do I know if I'm talking to one of your followers or I'm talking to one of your enemies? The Alter Rebbe said like this, my brother-in-law is here in Petersburg. And I'll tell you exactly what he was wearing. Because apparently the day that the Alter Rebbe sent him, he told him to go straight to Petersburg. He had no time to go home and get a change of clothing. So he knew that he was wearing the same clothes that he wore when he saw him. And the clothes that he wore then was also a little bit unusual. So he was able to describe it to him. So this officer was on a horse riding through the marketplace. And sure enough, he sees somebody who's dressed that way. He rides over to him and says, what's your name? But he couldn't give his true name because his documents had someone else's name, his friend's name. So he gave his friend's name. So he looked at him and said, you're a liar. Turned around and he left. The chassid was stunned. He didn't arrest him. He didn't say anything. He just asked him his name, told him he's a liar. So that night he came back to his friends, because a group of Hasidim were in Petersburg. They were the ones who were the activists, doing whatever they can to get the Alter Rebbe released from jail, doing like the political connections. And they had a meeting, and they decided this is probably something connected to the Alter Rebbe. Otherwise, it didn't make any sense. If you see him tomorrow, they decided, tell him your real name. Let's see what happens. In the meantime, he came back to the Alter Rebbe, and he told him, I met such a person, but he gave me a different name. And the Alter Rebbe said, that's probably because he doesn't have his documents on him. And to try him again tomorrow, you'll see, he'll probably tell you his true name. So the next day, he met the same guy in the marketplace, and he says to him, what's your name? And that day he told him Yisrael Kozak. He didn't say a word, he just turned around and started to move very slowly. Obviously, he didn't want to show outwardly that he's connecting to him. So the chassid understood that he should follow, and he followed him slowly from the distance. He went into a house. He waited outside, and a few minutes later, the window upstairs opened up, and something was thrown out. I'm not sure if it was a watermelon or a cantaloupe. One of the melon family was thrown out the window. He grabbed it, went to the place where the Hasidim were. They opened it up, and they found a piece of paper inside. And the piece of paper had the Alter Rebbe's handwriting, and it said, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So to them, this is the first piece of news that the Alter Rebbe is alive and well, and they were hoping that they'll soon also find out more information about the Alter Rebbe. And that was the one of the benefits that they had from this particular officer. And there was another incident that happened with this officer who also helped the Alter Rebbe in another way. We'll continue with that tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem. If you meet anybody on the way, please remind them, 825 Eastern Parkway. I know there was a wedding last night, so it was a late wedding, but you can still come to classes in the morning.
Just tell them, Shema Yisrael.
Okay. Wow, okay.